Factors Affecting Physiological Function by Jessica Gonzalez. Every journey begins with a step. Factors that affect physiological function during exercise. Factors that enhance the physiological process during exercise. We have all heard the following statement. Muscle burns more calories than fat, so having more lean muscle mass helps you stay leaner. Recent developing research studies and health publications support this consensus. It matters less what you weigh and or what your BMI happens to be than how much fat you have. People with the most body fat are more likely to die prematurely than people with leaner muscle mass fibers. Why is that? Excess adipose tissue prohibits muscle performance, making it less efficient and more susceptible to injury by weakening the sarcoplasmic endoplasmic reticulum processes. In addition, skeletal muscle is crucial for maintaining blood glucose homeostasis and energy balance. All that is true, unless you happen to be a swimmer, especially in cold waters. In this instances, having extra subcutaneous body fat is actually an advantage due to the extra insulation the swimmer receives. To say water is important to an athlete seems like an obvious statement. We are all mostly made of water, and without water we die. However, understanding exactly how and why adequate hydration affects athletic performance is different. Water regulates body temperature, lubricates joints, and transports the nutrients the body needs to maintain health. Under normal conditions of daily living, people just drink when they're thirsty. However, that can cause a problem to an athlete because their bodies may need a lot more fluid than their thirst indicates. During strenuous athletic events, it is not uncommon for athletes to lose 6 to 10% body weight in sweat loss. Fluid intake must equal fluid loss, and when exercising, especially in the heat, the body cools down by releasing fluid through sweat. Likewise, replacing bodily electrolytes will also enhance athletic performance by actually rehydrating the body instead of just increasing the amount of urine an athlete produces. This added sodium helps the body to retain the needed fluids and restores lost plasma volume. Therefore, hydration, especially when replacing electrolytes, can improve athletic performance. Physical conditioning is a factor that can make a big difference to an athlete regardless of the sport activity. This conditioning can take many forms, such as aerobic conditioning to improve VO2 max flexibility training and strength training. Strength training can result in increased strength, muscle hypertrophy, leaner body mass, increased connective tissue thickness, and, of course, improved physiological function. Alterations in hormone levels, neuromuscular junction activity, motor unit recruitment, and changes in the contractile proteins and muscle fibers are to blame for these positive changes. One of these physiological changes is an improved response to heat stress, including fine-tuning the body's sweat responses to more effectively cool the core temperature of the athlete. Thermal regulation then is easier to maintain in a fit versus an unfit individual. In today's world of advanced technology, clothing actually becoming a factor that can enhance physiological function when exercising. There are many factors to consider when buying clothing. The first, and probably the most obvious, is color. Lighter colors reflect heat, while darker colors absorb it. In addition, clothing is our extra protection from the elements, both reducing heat gain in hot climates and reducing heat loss in cold. In the heat, loose clothing allows air to flow against the skin, allowing the evaporation cooling system to work more effectively. Certain fibers even pull the moisture and heat from the body to allow for better thermoregulation. In the cold weather, the clothing, especially when layered with certain fabrics like wool, effectively trap air to provide insulation from the environment. Dry clothing is important because in the cold weather, wet clothing can lose almost all of its insulating properties because of the heat conduction rates of water. As such, fabric choices become important. Exercising is made more difficult. Factors that limit the physiological process during exercise. Exercise is made more difficult in both extreme heat and cold. If you think of your body as a machine, it makes sense. The chemical reactions that occur cause a side effect of heat, and heat flows from your core to your surrounding. That heat has to be released to maintain homeostasis. But how? The body has a mechanism in place to cool the skin through the evaporation of the sweat. The blood carries the heat to the surface, and this means that there is less blood available for the muscles and the organs. The heat now not only has to keep up its job of pumping blood, but now it has to pump the blood up to the skin. The heart is working harder to keep up with the body's air conditioning system, plus a higher body temperature. And all that sweat often creates a state of dehydration, reducing the volume of plasma and increasing plasma osmolality. Sweat output then cannot offset increase in core temperature. If a person exercises between 2 and 3 hours in the intense heat, dehydration can reach critical levels, especially when there's a lot of humidity as well. Of course, if this continues, it can be fatal. The stroke volume decreases in proportion of how much fluid is lost through sweat evaporation. To make it even more difficult for an endurance activity, oxygen is required to make ATP, the body's energy currency. And with the blood needed elsewhere, that becomes more difficult. The body flowing to the skin and the muscles also has to come from somewhere, and that somewhere is the other tissue in the body. So not only do the muscles not get all the oxygen they need, other bodily functions are compromised as well. When it starts getting to be too much for the body to handle, the core temperature begins to rise as the blood simply cannot be everywhere at once. Many problems can occur, such as heat cramps, heat syncope, heat exhaustion, and even heat stroke. It may be important then for people who are attending an athletic event in a hot climate to take this into consideration, make adjustment for the amount of fluid they might need to consume, and find ways to keep their body cooler. Exercising in the cold can also cause difficulties. For athletes who participate in cold weather events such as skiing, ice climbing, or dog sled racing, frostbite is a common occurrence. When the skin's temperature drops below -5 degrees Celsius, the exposed peripheral tissues, such as the nose, ears, fingers, and toes, can actually freeze. This is because these areas are further from the body's core. In deep tissue frostbite, the injury can even extend to the muscles and the bones. Another reason that extreme cold can limit physiological function is due to hypothermia, a condition that occurs when the body's core temperature slips below 95 degrees. In total heat losses greater than heat production. Mild hypothermia can cause shivering and other behavior changes. But during moderate and severe hypothermia, the athlete can actually lose their ability to shiver. Their pupils dilate and cardiac arrhythmias can occur. Eventually, they may lose consciousness. As the core temperature continues to decrease, the risk of cardiac event increases. Dehydration can also be a problem during cold weather, as air contains less moisture than warm air. And cold air can actually increase the production of urine. Being aware of the changes in the body would be very important to an athlete exercising in cold weather. In fact, knowing when the body is experiencing any signs of frostbite or hypothermia could save their lives. Another factor that limits physiological function during exercise is high altitude. The body struggles to do work in the thin, less oxygenated atmospheres, especially at elevations over 2,000 m. Although small declines in VO2 max are noticeable at much lower altitudes. As a matter of fact, the relative intensity for the work it takes to complete an activity is significantly different at higher altitudes. For example, hiking at even a slow speed at an elevation above 8,000 meters can decrease VO2 max so significantly that the intensity approaches 100%. What occurs is that the body senses that the level of oxygen is not at the usual level, and it begins to produce red blood cells to compensate. These red blood cells, called erythrocytes, carry oxygen to the blood. A hormone in the kidneys, erythropoietin, triggers the protein of erythrocytes in the bone marrow of the long bones. Oxidative stress, which is a disturbance in the body's balance of the production of free radicals and the antioxidant defenses, occurs at high altitudes when a person is engaging in vigorous physical activity. For every altitude increases of about 1,000 meters, the aerobic capacity of the athlete declines by almost 10%. In addition, lean body mass can be affected as muscle fibers can atrophy by as much as 20% when there is prolonged exposure. Athletes often lose their appetites, and as a result, getting enough food energy becomes problematic. Athletes who exercise at high altitudes could look into some forms of altitude training to possibly reduce the limitations. Most researchers agree that age in of itself can be mitigated as a factor in physiologic function if the level of fitness of that individual is high. In fact, a person who is older can actually have better aerobic capacity than a younger, less fit individual. However, there are some factors that do affect function, especially those relating to thermal regulation. Due to modified sensitivity of thermoreceptors, limited sweat gland output, and insufficient fluid replacement, getting older does present some challenges. The skin changes as we age, and that affects body's ability to dilate blood vessels near or at the skin. These changes can make it more difficult for older adults to regulate their core temperature. Interestingly, children can also have difficulties in this area as their bodies have lower sweating rate and higher core temperatures than older people. This can make strenuous exercise more taxing on the body. Different types of body composition is an important factor in physiologic function when exercising. People with excess body fat have more difficulty performing exercise, especially in the heat. This is because fat insulates the body and there is a smaller body surface area to mass ratio, which affects the ability to evaporate sweat. And while exercising in the heat is more difficult for people of all different body compositions, those who are obese are more than 3 times as likely to die of heat-related illnesses than their non-obese counterparts. The excess body fat also increases the energy that is needed for weight-bearing activities. Non-weight-bearing activities such as swimming has less affected by this factor. Factors that affect physiologic function during rest. What is the physiologic function during rest? Some people call it basal energy expenditure, or BEE, while other terms for it include basal metabolic rate, BMR, or even the resting metabolic rate. Even when we do pretty much nothing all day, we are still using calories